Hello, and welcome back to Parley. This prompt was written by Bionicme. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about exclusive stat boosts in build systems. We'll explain what that means. Bionicme says modifying various different stats is a common part of most buildcraft systems. Usually, building into one stat comes at the cost of not using that opportunity to increase a different stat. Pretty simple, and choosing between those options becomes a core part of build crafting. But sometimes games will just give some build pieces a stat boost for free, with no other alternatives. What gives? Why is this numerical increase not simply baked into the base stat value that you get to modify, and instead presented as a separate boost? Surely, whatever build piece gets the boost is balanced against other options with this fixed boost in mind. I have some ideas of what might be going on, but let me give some examples to illustrate. And your first one is really good, so let's just do it right now. There's Xingqiu from Genshin Impact and his 20% Hydro Damage passive talent. He's an old character, but even for that time, it stands out as an incredibly dull foil to the many more transformative passive talents in the game. Notably, Xingqiu does get a secondary benefit from Hydro Damage, in increasing the damage reduction granted by his other abilities by a small portion of his hydro damage. He scales his damage reduction from his abilities with that stat. But elemental damage is already a great stat with limited accessibility that most characters would build as much as they could opt in for. Right. So it's odd, isn't it? I mean, if one character has something that says 20% hydro damage, and other characters that do it, you don't have to have played Genshin Impact, like other hydro damage characters, don't have that. Surely the game isn't saying this character just does 20% more damage than those other characters, right? Let's just look at the possibilities for a little bit. I know for some people this might seem like going very basic, but there is something weird going on here if you dig down a level. I mean, there are two possibilities. Either Xingqiu has the same attack value as other Hydro characters, or whatever, it doesn't matter what game, and just has 20% more Hydro damage, meaning he's just 20% better than they are, basically, unless they have some other abilities to compensate. Or their base attack values were adjusted to make it balanced such that his 20% Hydro damage doesn't matter. You know, he has less attack, but hydro damage that compensates. If the second thing is true, it is mildly different than him just having the same attack value. You know, because he already has a lot of hydro damage, now that's a slightly less valuable multiplier. But that's pedantic in this example. It would still be valuable to build a lot of that, even though technically multipliers get less strong the more of them you have. If you have a lot of attack gets less good and crit usually gets better, as long as this is a game where crit and attack multiply each other, which they do in most games. Yeah, but not by that much, right? It's only 20%. So it's weird, isn't it? It either means nothing, either he's balanced so that his damage is about even to everybody else, but just the way he gets there in the back end is that he has lower attack, but more hydro damage, and you, the player, kind of arguably don't need to know that. Or he is just 20% better than the other characters. No strings attached. He just has the same attack and 20% more hydro damage. Like, okay. And then presumably his utility is weaker to compensate. But does this really reassure you that he's that much better? It's odd. I hope you'll now agree, now that we've explained it out. It's a little weird to do this kind of passive. I mean, in another way, you could just say, okay, well, there's his base attack value, the hydro damage passive, and then like what his attacks actually do, right? You could just remove the hydro damage passive and make his abilities do 20% more damage. That's basically what it does, right? It's very odd to have that listed as a separate thing on the surface. So what we're going to do in this parlay is diagnose some reasons why that might be. This isn't going to be a thing I often do in this situation, which is a kind of dev detective exercise. Why specifically did these specific developers do this thing? I'm not going to focus on that as much here. I think that can be interesting and valuable to do as an exercise. You can never really know, but it is helpful to think about why a piece of design is in a game. It's helpful because it often isn't a game design related reason. Often when you look, there are motivations to do this in a game, but they don't really have to do with making the game better. There are good reasons to do it. Well, arguably good reasons to do it, logical reasons to do it. But they don't have to do with making the game more fun. And I think that is helpful to notice. We will do some of that here, but again, we're not going to worry too much about specifically in this specific game or the other games we're going to use as examples why this was done. We're going to think more about what does it do as a piece of design. I think that's the more helpful thing. You as a game designer, if you do this, what are the effects? Let's say you agree with their logical but not game design related reason to make this decision, and then you do it in your own games. Well, what are the game design effects? That would still be useful to know. And for you as a player, well, if you play games like this, if a game telegraphs that it has this kind of design decision in it, do you like that? Are we good with that? Maybe you don't want to play games that take that approach, that, focus their gameplay on things that are not motivated by fun gameplay. Maybe that isn't good in your mind, or maybe you don't care. And what might you do to adapt around that? Sure, let's go. So let's start here and just think about this simple example. The 20% hydro damage passive is listed on its own, even though, as we've explained, there are many ways that it could just be kind of blended into the background. And surely, when other characters have other abilities instead of this like passive talent effect that just increases a character's damage, well, that other character in the background has a talent that says they do 20% less damage in exchange for having this other ability. But that would just be kind of redundant to say. Or maybe you don't think of that would be redundant to say, but I think it is. An example that comes to mind is that in Monster Hunter Wilds, when you boot up the game, there is a default option enabled that makes it so weapons that swing slower have a relatively higher listed attack value. You can switch this off, and weapons will have the same for a given rarity, for a given weapon type, attack value. The purpose of it seems to be that they're trying to represent that a greatsword will do more damage per hit than a pair of dual blades, which hit faster. It's weird though, because that just makes the greatsword look overpowered. If the dual blades do less damage and have no other advantages, then aren't they just bad? But of course they're not, because they attack faster, right? The game doesn't say that, but you as a player kind of know it. But by that same logic, if you just made the greatsword have the same damage value as the dual blades, wouldn't the player go, well, but then the greatsword is just bad? Except of course it isn't, because it has slower but harder hitting attacks, which people just intuitively know. It's the exact same thing. Having the game inflate the stat doesn't remove the need for an assumption on the player's part to make the game seem balanced. It just changes what the assumption is arbitrarily. Why is that good? It's better to just tell the player the information and then they make the assumptions they make. You could say it like the attack value is an average damage per second value, which it kind of is. And then all things being equal, in a perfectly balanced version of the game, the greatsword will do the same damage output as the dual blades, but with the same attack value. That's why. If you increase your attack value, it'll do that much more damage per second on average, but it will do it in less larger hits rather than more smaller hits, which again is probably intuitive. I would think would be probably intuitive. I don't know. And so it's odd to kind of draw attention to that. What are some reasons this might be being done? I'll warn you, though I think this is fun as part of the process, this part of the parlay is going to be full of like reasons for doing this, but just really bad reasons. And don't worry, like there will be some good game design reasons in here. I will take care of that for you, but we got to get through some stuff. Bionicme begins with one. Perhaps the intent is to give players not experienced with Buildcraft a very obvious hint of sorts, like saying, this character sacrifices transformative passive effects to just gain a fair chunk of this one stat. It must be a stat they really want to build. You should really build hydro damage. Now, the frustrating thing about that is that in the context of Genshin Impact, and most games really, You would already want to do that. That doesn't really change anything. So while it might key some players in that, oh, maybe I'll build hydro damage on this character, I mean, he's an older character, and so now the game has lots of, other characters that don't tutorialize that, right? If this was a tutorial, a very weird form of tutorial, it's a very bad form of tutorial because you only get it at random, and it's unnecessarily subtle. You could just say it is beneficial to build this stat because it's a separate multiplier with these other things. That's okay. The game pops up tutorials from time to time. Why not just have one pop up that like tells you it's good to build your character's elemental damage type? Not for nothing, I also think that among people who don't think about multipliers and the underlying simple but underlying math very much, I would imagine that for most players it is relatively obvious that building your character's elemental damage type is a good thing to do. You know what I mean? There's very few things the game directs you toward as decisively as the character says they are a hydro or whatever character, and there is a stat in the game called hydro damage percent. I would imagine most players that are not thinking about it that logically would be incentivized to build that stat pretty heavily already. And so, does this really do anything? Like, if it is a tutorial of sorts, I think it's a very bad tutorial. This isn't a criticism of you, Bionicme. I think that that's a very good point. I think that is a reason, technically a reason, not good reasoning, but a reason that somebody might think it would be good to include this, but it's very ineffective. Like, that's clutter-y and for not much benefit. Here are some other reasons that you could do such a thing. Again, what we're discussing is why draw attention to this stat boost that is basically just the part of the character's core operation instead of just not drawing attention to that. The game doesn't make it a passive when a character has slightly lower base damage than another character. The game doesn't have a line of text that says, hey, by the way, compared to other characters in this element, this character has slightly lower or higher base damage. And that's like their whole thing. The game doesn't do that. And that's all that this does. That's all this hydro damage passive does. So what's the deal? Like, why? Some other reasons it could be. The very first one for me is to fill space. It's to fill space. I mean, we don't want to do the dev detective thing too much because it doesn't matter what they're doing in Genshin Impact. But it's to fill space. It's because they need to fill out for the game's monetization. They need to fill out, 4 talent passives. Every character in Genshin Impact has 6 abilities that they unlock when you get a 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th copy of them, because they want you to spend more money on the game, so they want the character to feel incomplete when you've only got 1 copy of them, and so they need to fill those slots. Now, knowing that they don't want to have 6 passives for every character, the developer has wisely made it so that 2 of the passives are always at this copy of the character. You increase the rank of their skill. Their elemental skill does more damage. And at this rank, once you have this many copies of them, you increase the rank of their elemental burst, their big bongo ultimate ability. So they only have to come up with 4 for each character. And this is a character where they did not come up with 4. They just decided to fill one of the spots by basically saying, hey, by the way, this character has a little bit maybe lower, he might not even, base attack or less flexibility, but in exchange is more focused on just doing hydro damage, and he benefits from the hydro damage more. You might want to build this stat. And so we'll give you a little bit of it up front. Basically the same as saying nothing. It's like saying the game is balanced. Just a quick reminder, player. The game is balanced. Didn't you know? Or this character wasn't balanced, but now that you have this copy of this character, now they are balanced. Just thought we'd let you know about that. The talent doesn't do anything, but we just thought we'd remind you that that this is a balanced game, but only once you have this many copies of this character. Thank you for your attention. Bye now. And it's like, okay, that's very strange, but I do think that legitimately, in this case, I feel the number one reason is that they literally just wanted to fill the slot, and most people do not think about this the amount that we have thought about it in the past 15 minutes. I think that's the answer in this case. That's not good, of course. It makes the game cluttered for no real reason. It'd be kind of better to have it be that the character had some portion of their other effects rolled up in this talent just to make it so that the character felt like they were more piecemeal or progressing and they had their full damage innately. They were balanced innately. But they just have some minor abilities that they don't have until they get this talent. For example, Xingqiu in Genshin Impact has an ability, a pretty minor feature of his kit, where when his defensive abilities deactivate, the rain swords, is what they're called, burst. They stop defending the active character and they heal you for a little bit. This is very minor, so it wouldn't really make him much less powerful if that were offloaded into a talent you don't innately get until you have more copies of him. But it would be a good change, in my opinion, because it would feel like a meaningful piece of progression. You do get an ability, a genuinely new ability that he did not do before for getting more copies of the character. I don't think that's a good model for the game for players to have fun with. It's a model that is incentivized by making money, not by being fun. But if that is the model we have, I think it is better for them to be meaningful progression. And the key thing for me is that it means he is inherently balanced from the start. I think that's important. And the talents don't make him balanced, they just add new effects. This has the knock-on effect that characters without a bunch of copies of them are a little simpler, which maybe isn't the worst thing in the world, right? They're a little more straightforward for people to understand. So I think that filling space is the reason, and is a very bad reason for this to be here. And it would be much better to just swap this and some small effect from his abilities. Goodness, those Genshin Impact characters have enough little side effects to their abilities. This is always easy to do with characters in Genshin Impact. And then the knock-on effect would be that you can just not say that he has 20% more hydro damage. Just make that be an innate thing, or buff his abilities commensurately. And that would make the character slightly less textually dense. You have less to read to understand the character, combined with making them feel like they have a meaningful progression point if you get more copies. A progression model I don't like, but which is the game's design. And so I guess I'll just accept it and make that feel more like meaningful progression. There are other characters in Genshin Impact that are like this, and those situations are equally bad, in my opinion. Let's move on to some other examples and see if we can think of other reasons why you would do this, like why you'd have an additional effect listed on a character that like doesn't really do anything and basically just gestures to the idea that the game is indeed balanced somewhat. But like I would have assumed that why this is a nothing burger of an effect. Another example is a recent addition to Warframe's arsenal in the dual coda Torxica, Torxica, Torxica. Final answer. A weapon that when killing an enemy debuffs a few more nearby enemies with cold status effects and 50% more damage taken from itself as a unique multiplier. That's pretty good. On paper, this gives the weapon some incentive to target specific enemies, and gives it a slow to start, but starts killing spree once it gets going type of gameplay. Similar to the Piranha Prime, for example. When you get enough kills, you get a phantom one and it reloads, and you get 2 for a little while. Okay, but in practice, the Toxicra mostly deals 50% more damage to everything due to the generous trigger condition and application uptime of the buff. Right, so it's like, surely because that basically has 50% more damage all the time, the weapon is just weaker at base in exchange. Now, at their best, these effects can be, they are not active all the time. When they are active, the weapon does above the curve a little bit too strong damage, and when they're not active, the weapon does a little below the curve, a little too little damage, and thus the weapon is kind of balanced, and the effect just kind of vaguely gestures at that. Yes, it kind of just reminds you that the weapon is balanced, but it tells you the weapon is at its full power, and the advantages of this weapon come out when you fulfill these conditions, and here is how big of a damage boost you lose if you do not fulfill those conditions. That can be fine. You could say this is kind of... I like this example, by the way, Bionicme. This is a really nice progression from the last one. It's kind of the same thing. It's kind of just saying, like, the game is balanced, indeed. But it evokes the design trade-off that the designers had in mind when they made the weapon at its best. They thought, ideally anyway, they thought, we're going to make a weapon that is a little underpowered unless you jump through this hoop. That could be an interesting little mini gameplay challenge to add variety to the the game's weapons. And then when you do jump through the hoop, the weapon is a little more powerful than other weapons in exchange for a limited time. That concept seems cool. Nothing wrong with that. That's normal. And then the number of the damage on the weapon's passive effect that activates this is just there to telegraph to the player that that is the design idea of the weapon. You could even literally just say in a different game, this weapon is weaker when it has not done this, but when you do this, it is stronger than other weapons. And then the game is just telling you, again, like how big of a deal it is to activate that condition. It is weaker than other weapons if you don't do this, but not by that much. Or in this case, it's weaker than other weapons if you don't do this by a lot. 50% as a separate multiplier that's very large, right? It does 1.5 times damage when you've met the condition. The weapon is likely pretty bad if you don't fulfill the condition. But that's only if you assume the game is balanced, so interesting. So I think that it's true that this is kind of related to the previous one that you suggested, Bionicme. It's kind of a very blunt way to nudge the player toward building a certain way, or in this case, into playing a certain way. The game is saying, here is your specific incentive for, killing enough enemies in a row or whatever. Getting a kill on an enemy in this case. And by making the number more concrete, you know what you're working with. You understand, again, how relatively big of a deal it is, ideally. I'll note here that without telling the player that the 50% more damage is as a separate multiplier, the player does not know how big of a deal it is, because 50% more damage could be of a type of damage they already have. Therefore, the marginal benefit of getting even more is not very high. In this case, it is very high because it's a separate multiplier, but unless the game tells you that, it doesn't actually fulfill the goal of genuinely telling the player how much of an advantage fulfilling the condition is, because the player doesn't know 50% more of what damage, my total damage or just this one category. Again, many players won't think of this, like that just won't occur to them. I just want to point out that in terms of actually telling the player this is how much of an advantage you get, technically it does not do that until you say this is what multiplier you get. So likewise, you could even go further and say Singchu's 20% hydro damage doesn't actually tell you that he is balanced until you know how separate multipliers work as well, because then you have the context to understand, oh, this means he'll scale a little better with more attack, for example, 20% better, a little better. But a lot of people have not realized that fundamental mathematics that is true in a lot of games, and so the result is it may just seem like, oh, he's better at hydro damage. Like, not really, but I mean, sure, it points in that direction. But sure, there's a tutorial element here, and I think this is one of the more successful ones in a way. Again, it does tell the player, this is the pattern of gameplay we imagined for this weapon, and there's a relatively big, hopefully you assume it's relatively big because we didn't make that clear by telling you it's a separate multiplier, there's a relatively big carrot for, playing in this way. Sure. And you could say there's another goal rolled in here, which is to provide variety to the player, to make it so it is beneficial to play some weapons in different ways. Now here again, I warned you at the beginning of this parlay, there's going to be a lot of examples where that doesn't really work, but you can see that that's sort of the category of good that this would be going for. I mean, the condition being to kill an enemy in a horde shooter is not really nudging the player in a very different playstyle direction. It's just like the thing you do in these games. But if you do it in this case, you really want to kill the enemies this time. It's like, that's not, I'm sorry, Warframe, I'm being a little mean, I am. But you see my point. Like, that's not really a different type of gameplay, really. That condition is a little bit too broad, to the point that you would really never not be doing that with this weapon. Yeah, it's true that if enemies start at a very high power level, it's entirely possible that this weapon will feel good at killing enemies in a timely manner when it has 50% more damage, but not when it doesn't. There could be a relatively precise difficulty level where that would be true, sure. And then at that difficulty level, what you'll probably feel is that it will be beneficial to target weaker enemies first, activate the passive, and then move to stronger enemies, which that's sort of cool, sure. Okay. So that provides some gameplay texture. Again, you can see how that is a reasonable thing to do in game design. This just isn't maybe the best way to do it. The thing it's trying to do, perfectly reasonable. This just isn't that good of a way to do that thing, maybe. I like Pyrana Prime because I believe it's like 3 kills. Pyrana Prime is an automatic shotgun in Warframe, and you have to get a few kills with a limited magazine in a short period of time. And then the reward is you reload the magazine and you get 2 and you can fire faster and do more damage. But it's kind of mostly good when you have those 3 distinct enemies to kill in a short period of time. And they've got to be vulnerable to Pyrana Prime, which is a very slashy weapon in Warframe that's heavily mitigated by enemy armor. And so you need to plan around it a little bit. It does kind of make you play in a slightly different way. And when you get the doubled, the ghostly Pyrana and you're dual wielding them, you really feel that. That's a kind of noticeable bump in gameplay, sure. Okay, now for a kind of second part of this parlay. My final example, Bionicme says, is Monster Hunter series' Hunting Horn, a weapon class that can provide itself and allies significant buffs. I'll be overlooking the supportive aspect here, focusing on the horn as designed to benefit from its own buffs. Corner horners deny duding dignity. Yes, there's the people that just sit in the corner and play their hunting horn, but we're focusing on you getting the benefit of the hunting horn, yes. The different weapon classes in the games don't share the exact same upgrade trees of available weapons, but where there is overlap, they usually have the exact same stats. Terribly oversimplifying for brevity, explaining motion values is probably beyond the scope of this parlay. Right, we're not going to get into it. This is just what I was saying before about the point where in Monster Hunter, the weapons have like the same core attack if you disable that options menu option that makes that obfuscated. And you're obviously just meant to understand that a hunting horn, a gigantic hammer, kind of, basically, is going to do more damage with each individual hit than dual blades, even though they have the same listed attack stat, because it's a video game and there are literally no games where it doesn't work like that. And if heavier weapons just did less damage, they would obviously all just be terrible. So it would be very weird if the player didn't assume that. And in the first place, if you do make the hunting horn and the greatsword or whatever have a higher attack value, then it just makes the fast weapons look bad because the game doesn't say what attack speed or whatever weapons have. So it's not more clear either way. It is better to just say they have equivalent core attack. But the thing is, hunting horns often have offensive buffs that will say something like if a hunting horn has 20% damage melody, is it 20% stronger than the same weapon in other weapon classes? Surely not. Different horns will have different melody options, however, so there at least are good choices to be made between those. But all horns come with the self-improvement melody, which is incredibly easy to use and gives a handful of small but very nice buffs. The purpose of this may be to have the player engage with the specific mechanics of the horn, even if it's really easy to do that. Right, so there's a couple of things going on here. The first one is similar to what we've seen before. Like, if the hunting horn has a song that is extremely easy to do, to the point where it's kind of hard not to do it, how hunting horn works, just by the way, if you haven't played Monster Hunter, is that your 3 basic ways to attack enemies, Y, B, and then pressing Y and B together, will put notes on a little music staff. And once you play a combination of 2 or 3 or 4, then you can hit a different button, I think right trigger, I forget exactly, to play that song. You do an attack, and then you provide a buff to yourself and usually allies. So basically it's just a weird hammer, or like a big mace, that you can then play as an instrument. You do a combination of attacks, and then you get a benefit for doing that combination of attacks. Pretty straightforward. So every combination of attacks, just about every combination of attacks, is a melody. Would give you a buff. Not literally every combination, but a very large percentage of combinations of attacks. Self-improvement on most hunting horns is literally just do one of your only 2 basic attack buttons twice in a row. That's it. Again, almost not possible to not engage with by default. If you just refuse to hit the play melody button, I guess that's one thing, but like why? Monster Hunter only has like 4 buttons that do an offensive action, so, I mean, you probably just will hit that button, even if you don't even know about the melody mechanic, and then you'll hopefully notice, oh, 1 came out. So it's weird. Self-improvement is so easy to perform and is on every hunting horn and provides some basic buffs. Why don't you just have that as a benefit? Surely hunting horns are balanced around you having those buffs. They all have the ability to get those buffs after all. And it's incredibly easy, to the point of it being almost impossible not to maintain those buffs, So why aren't they just an innate part of the weapon? Why does the game feel the need to say, hey, by the way, this weapon is balanced, kind of like the other options? Like, why? And most players probably don't get that message from it. They probably think, hey, you just need to do this every now and again. And it's like, okay, well, let's ask the question the other way. Why do I need to do this every now and again? There's not really any cost to doing this now and again, is there? Well, let's investigate that. One reason these kinds of things could be done is that sometimes it means the player has to do like other work. Again, a more nuanced version of the previous example. You've got to kill one enemy, way too easy, but you got to kill 3 enemies in one magazine. Okay, that's a more meaningful challenge. You do just do the thing. You're gonna be trying to kill 3 enemies in a short period of time in Warframe. That's like the gameplay loop. But killing 3 enemies in the same magazine of the Piranha Prime is actually a little bit of a challenge sometimes. And so that is a meaningful piece of texture. Likewise, playing the self-improvement melody, as simple as it may be a meaningful part of the gameplay loop if there are enough songs you want to play besides it that it actually does make it difficult to juggle all the different songs. My opinion is it doesn't, so I don't know. But I'm just saying that's not the point of this parlay. Again, I don't know why they actually did do it over at Capcom. They could have been thinking anything over there. Um, but just to say that is a reasonable thing that could be part of a game's design. There could be a benefit to forcing you to play self-improvement. And one of the many benefits there could be in this example is that it makes it harder to balance all your melodies. It kind of balances out the other melodies by making it more of an opportunity cost to need to play each melody. You've added another one to the stack, or you lose those buffs. At best, it could even be an interesting gameplay choice. Do I neglect to re-up that melody, and instead I play something else, right? You could make a similar system. You could make something like the hunting horn can only have 3 melody buffs active or whatever. And then so because self-improvement is one of the buffs, now that's kind of a choice you have to make when you manage your buffs. If the hunting horns have more than 3 buffs and self-improvement is one of them, it's different than if it were innate. It is now kind of a choice. There's kind of a buildcraft thing in there. But otherwise, if it doesn't limit the amount of micromanagement you have to do, and it doesn't make itself a kind of build choice, what melody buffs do you have up, then why do you have to do it? Well, another reason Bionicme suggested is that, again, it's kind of a tutorial, like a different version, where to get a thing that is basically a free buff for all hunting horns, you do technically have to use the melody mechanic, which helps hook that in for a lot of players. Now, I'm not sure I'm convinced that it does do that. I don't think that actually works very well. That is probably just annoying to most players, and people who don't think about the games this way probably won't play self-improvement because they don't know what it does, and it's the basic song every hunting horn has, so they get in the mindset of, oh, that's the basic thing, so you don't use that. And they're not in the buildcraft mindset where, well, it shouldn't really be in the game if there's no point in using it. But I don't know. I'm just saying I don't think it's that effective, but sure, the purpose could be this is the kind of gateway drug into using melodies or something. Again, I'm not sure that works at all in the actual world we live in, but is there a reason, a bad reason maybe, but a reason for that to be a mechanic? Sure. And there could be other reasons as well. I'm not an expert at Monster Hunter's hunting horn, so for example, maybe when you are a high-level hunting horn player, needing to manage self-improvement and all the other melodies while doing, I don't know what other good hunting horn stuff there is, echo bubbles, for example. I don't know nothing about hunting horn. Maybe it is a meaningful expenditure of time, and so self-improvement being a melody does balance it out a little bit, but I just don't know enough about hunting horn to know that that's the case. That's possible, sure. And that could be a good design decision, sure, by all means. Okay, let's bring it home a little bit and tie it up. From these 3 examples, Bionicme, you said, I mainly observed 2 answers to the question. This is being done to guide new players with obvious build examples or easily achievable gameplay conditions, basically the tutorializing thing, or to incentivize the player to engage with specific systems or play a certain way, even if it doesn't actually alter much. In the best scenario, even small playstyle changes could help reinforce the fantasy that the game or specific build piece is trying to sell. Now, I think that is rolled into the tutorial one. I would say my conclusion from this approach to the parlay is if we were doing the game dev detective thing, which I said I wanted to slightly divest the parlay from, we would conclude that it seems like game designers think that this is an effective technique to tutorialize, because it seems like the primary, most obvious thing it would do, maybe not very effectively, but that it would do in most of these games, is to encourage the player to do something that is generally a good thing to do. Now, in some cases, the thing that the game is encouraging the player to do, that is generally a good thing to do, is such a generally good thing to do that it's kind of comical to think that the game feels like you need to encourage people to do that, like killing one enemy. I'm looking at you, Warframe. Or again with Singchu, building your character's element damage percentage is the right choice on very close to 100% of all possible character builds that do anything in Genshin Impact. There are very few things in Genshin Impact that are so universally a good decision as building your character's damage percentage. There are times when you might not want to do that. Healers are the big example that comes to mind, and even then, a good amount of them benefit from you doing that as well. It's not very useful to encourage players to do that thing, because it is almost impossible to play the game without doing that thing. And in Warframe, again, encouraging players to kill enemies is good, I guess, but it's like encouraging the player to move around and jump in a game with platforming. You will need to do that to complete the game, but I'm not sure it was in question that that was the thing the player was going to do. So sure, with Monster Hunter's Hunting Horn, you can a little bit more see, oh yeah, like you get the player into melodies with a one that is so easy that nobody will mess it up. Sure, I guess. But ultimately, I think that this is why it's beneficial to focus the parlay on what could be good reasons for doing these things in games, rather than what was the reason that it was put in, or what are some of the actual reasons. Because the actual reasons, as far as we can tell, aren't very good. You know, you might as well just not have done most of these things. Again, a critical point for me that you heard me coming back to is that for many of these things, if they were to successfully tutorialize the game for a player, the player would have to think in a way where they probably don't need to be tutorialized to. For example, if Hydra damage percentage affects how you make builds in any way, you already know enough about the build system that you don't need this as a piece of tutorialization. And if it doesn't affect how you make builds, then it definitely doesn't do anything. So it might just be there to fill space for marketing purposes. We talked about that before. Again, same thing with the hunting horn thing. If you don't think of hunting horn as being a weapon where you can play different songs to get buffs, a player who looks at a hunting horn song where you hit YYBY, that's more complicated than the self-improvement song where you just hit BB, but it's not complicated at all. You literally just do one different attack while spamming Y. Oh boy, you hold me back. A player who thinks that is too complicated will not enjoy the hunting horn. You see what I mean? Like, it seems to me that way anyway. So is it really good to have something that encourages the player to hook into that tactic so simple and basic that a player who's able to do it doesn't really demonstrate that they're a person who will enjoy what hunting horn's going to go on to do? I don't know. That's tricky. And again, it's possible there are other meaningful balance things in self-improvement. It is possible a more advanced hunting horn player would now chime in and say, no, it actually does make it more difficult to balance all your melodies. That's cool. That could be a good reason to do it. This is what I mean by pairing apart why it seems like they did it, and let's just imagine some positive benefits it could have. Sure, I don't know, the game could be like that. Maybe should be like that. Maybe it would be good to make the game make it so it's hard to juggle all your melodies. And then you have an easy one, but it just isn't as beneficial as some of the other ones. And so if you have a melody buff fall off and you don't have the situation where you're going to do another melody, maybe you do self-improvement. And then that kind of rounds out the weapon's flavor a little bit, sure. And for many players, maybe it feels that way. Again, it doesn't really matter for this parlay whether these things are this way or not in the actual game. That isn't perfectly objectifiable anyway. It would depend on your skill level and your perspective on the game's mechanics and how difficult of an enemy you're fighting, and etc. It doesn't matter what their actual reasons were. We can't really know that, and it's on us to speculate. What I think is interesting to notice is that games holding the player's hand, if you view it that way, is sort of like good at heart, but often misguided. So, for example, having a weapon where when you get a few kills in a row, you do more damage, but when you haven't gotten a few kills in a row, it's a little inferior, seems like a great idea. But it's interesting that when taken to its simplest extreme, it's kind of silly. Again, the Warframe example, the dual coda Torsica is what I went with, I think. If you only need to kill one enemy to activate the effect, you essentially just always have the 50% damage boost. The trigger condition and the application or uptime of the buff are just too high, and so you basically just always have that, which removes the point of that texture. It's almost like the game piece is pretending to be deep. And this is where, unfortunately, I'm going to say something a little cynical to end the parlay. I think that a lot of games have the appearance of build system depth, but don't. That is, if you were to know all builds, which you can't fully do, but know more about the build system, go really deep on it, my experience is that most games are revealed to be shallow if you get to that point. There are a lot of examples of games I can think of where playing the game normally, you could very conceivably not get to the point where it is revealed that the game is shallow. But there are also many examples of games where I feel like you probably will, toward the end, sort of take off the mask of the game and reveal that, in fact, there's kind of conditions in here that make it look like there's compelling decisions to make, but that wasn't actually fleshed out. It's much easier to make it look like there are compelling choices than to actually flesh them out. And if the player doesn't get to the point where they notice, you could argue it's just as good. And maybe surprising you, for me, yeah, I agree. There are games where, sure, it doesn't really make sense to do the work of making a really complex build system. The thing is, in those games, it would also not be worth the work to make there be a fake build system, in my opinion, if it doesn't feel like the options are genuinely better than each other. If you look even the barest glance and that reveals that the game is actually just shallow in that way, just don't have a build system. Just don't put a build system in. Don't pretend to put one in. Don't put a real one in. It's more work, and the game has no intention of following through with that. So just don't put one in. It makes it much easier to make a good game. You can just not put one in. You can do a mini build system choice, like in Doom 2016. You get a weapon, and you can get two little module thingies, I don't know what they call them in that game, for the weapon, that upgrade an aspect of the weapon by a little bit. So the weapon is mostly the same, but you can kind of customize the way of using the weapon you want a little more and make your loadout a little more suited to you. Don't like the hand cannon weapon? Well, you can lean into making it fire explosive bullets, or maybe ricochet bullets, or make it more of a sniper or something. Have it be better when aiming down sights at range. Not big changes. It doesn't really change the combat economy of the game that much overall, but it means that if you don't like the feel of a weapon a little, but the game is balanced around you switching weapons a lot, you can just nudge it a little more in the direction you want. Great addition. Not super deep, not that complicated, doesn't need to be. It's trying to accomplish a different goal. It's trying to let the player kind of flex the weapons more to their playstyle. If you fired an actual gun in your actual hand to fight actual factual demons, and you were the Doom guy in Doom, you would probably want to grip the gun in a way different from the way I would, by a little bit, perhaps. Maybe it would just be more comfortable for your literal body. You do play this game with a control interface of some kind. I play with mouse and keyboard. A lot of people like Doom on a controller. And that's exactly the point. You would want to adjust it a little bit based on your preference. And so the game lets you adjust it a little bit based on your preference. That lines up. It doesn't make sense for Doom to be a game where you could adjust it a lot a bit, because the game is about having a kind of combat puzzle. Different enemies that respond well or poorly to different tactics, that drop different types of ammo or, combat resources like health or shields. and which allow you to switch through tactics and have fun having a variety of weapons and being a utility badass that can kill demons in all sorts of ways, but without feeling like you need to specifically use a weapon that you really, really don't like. You can kind of get around using that exact specific weapon, and you can nudge that weapon a little bit if the developers were close, but not quite to the target that you would have wanted, that you would have enjoyed as a version of that weapon. That's a really good design technique. It means that the game can be more flexible, but still be focused and have a deliberate combat loop. I think that another of the many reasons why games add build systems at all to their games, getting a little afield of your topic for this parlay, is simply that other games in the market have them. Is that there are other competing open world or whatever games that have skill trees, and this game feels like that would be a benefit that they wouldn't be able to compete with their competitor if they didn't add. But games are not like buying a lawnmower. It's not better to have more features. It's better for the game to be more focused on what it is going to be good at. Consumers with no free time do not have the time to realize this, and so think, well, this game kind of looks just lesser than this other game, like an appliance. But it's not an appliance. And that's not the player's job to know, really, though it does benefit you a lot to know that if you play games. It's the developer's job. And it's the publisher's job not to make the game seem like every other game, like an appliance, but to make the game seem like it is good at its own thing. And I understand this. As a business endeavor, many AAA games and AAA publishers are thinking, well, we want to make it look like the other games so people just buy it. It's just the game to have now, and it looks like the other game, and that game was the game you had to have, and you can't be up on the social credits or whatever the hell benefit people think they get from playing popular things if you don't play this thing. There is literally no benefit, and I hate it. But that's how it is. That's how people buy games, and so sure, they feel like they need to make it look like those other games. But I think that is kind of just a failure to market properly. Don't you think? The game has things that are unique about it, often buried under a layer of generification that they felt like they needed to do to make it look like other games in the market. But people often enjoy games that are a breath of fresh air when the game is clearly, apparently a breath of fresh air. It's just that a lot of games don't market themselves that way. In fact, I, in my experience, have played a lot of games that are a breath of fresh air, but you wouldn't know it from the way the game is marketed. The game appears to be the same thing as everything else, but just actually isn't when you play it, or there is a meaningful, robust way to play it that really isn't the same as a lot of other games. And it's really interesting to see the examples, the rare examples we have of games that are very popular in the industry that don't really have marketing, and how they are just like weird and different from other games in the genre. But because they don't have any marketing material, nobody is really made to think anything about the game before they play it. And so they just like, it just is good at the things it's good at. It's amazing how that can kind of benefit games a little. You don't have usually the wrong assumption, and then you go into the game and just like figure out what it's actually about. Now, of course, games marketing still shapes how they're perceived, even if the game doesn't do like paid deliberate marketing. For example, Limbus Company famously doesn't do a huge amount of marketing outside of, I think, Japan they do. But anyway, in a lot of the world, and like in the US where the game is very popular, they don't do a lot of marketing. Limbus Company is like, I think 30 right now on the Steam charts, which is pretty popular in the grand scheme of things. It's pretty rare for a game that high up to not have basically any marketing, for it to be likely that people who are playing it have never ever seen the game marketed to them. That's very strange. Like, that's weird. And I suppose it's possible that somehow that isn't true, that there just is a pocket of marketing in some weird but very populous part of the world where we don't really know about the marketing going on as well. But that makes me think of the Chinese market, maybe. I don't know. But the point is, let's assume that's the case. And so, of course, people's perception of the game is still sometimes shaped, but just like by the community for the game, or by creators, people who make stuff about the game, potentially, build videos or whatever made about the game. It's just influenced in a way that is inherently more about what the game is actually about, because the only people that talk about those things are people who have well, not the only people, but mostly the people, have played the game. And so it's more influenced about what the game is actually about, not what the game says it's about. And that kind of two-layered form of business is pretty interesting to me. You could look at these examples that way. Briefly, let's do that. If you look at Genshin Impact and Warframe and Monster Hunter, are these games where the oversimplified version of understanding the game's mechanics and build system will be a fun way to engage with the game's mechanics and build systems? No, probably not. Maybe in Genshin Impact, there are often pretty limited, interesting ways to build characters. But in Warframe, having a big clunky loadout system and then the player like doesn't want to understand it at all probably won't lead you to actually enjoy this game that much. There'll be a big annoyance in the way if you just want to enjoy the flow of the gameplay, the build system. And if you do like the build system, then you definitely don't need the game to encourage you to kill enemies, is what it says in my notes. I'm pretty sure the player would have figured that out on their own, especially if they think about builds literally at all. And then in Monster Hunter, if playing BB as a weapon combo is too complicated for you, you will probably not like Monster Hunter, let alone Hunting Horn for Monster Hunter. So that is kind of it's a little separate from your Parley topic, but a quibble I have is that I think that there are many fairly obvious motivations for doing these things, but I think that they're not good motivations. I don't think they really make sense. I think they're trying to make games that probably won't appeal to some people appear to appeal to those people, but then down the line they really won't, or to get people to give the game a chance where they wouldn't have, and then sometimes this will make someone who really would have enjoyed that, but just didn't know they would enjoy that part of the game, kind of get there. You know what I mean? I refer to this concept as a ramp in philosophy, something that gets you, that really isn't good in and of itself, and if you have thought about the subject a lot, it's not useful or beneficial. If I'm trying to get somewhere, and I can comfortably climb the stairs or jump to where I need to go, putting something in my way isn't good. But if I wasn't willing to get there on my own, then it is excellent, required, you could argue, to have there be a ramp to help me get there. And so while for an experienced person these might be bad, they could arguably be not only good but kind of necessary for people that are that haven't gotten a lead up to it. My proposition here is that the kind of person who will go on to enjoy these games' build systems probably won't respond meaningfully to these design principles, and most of the people who would respond well to these things probably won't go on to enjoy the game's build systems. So is it really effectively getting the player like actually into the game, or does it just get the player long enough into the game that they're outside of the 2-hour refund window on Steam, which, to be fair, doesn't apply to 2 of these games, but many more games in the industry are like this. So yeah, pretty cynical. I think that it's complicated, right? Like a lot of games do not have a fully propagated reasoning behind them. They don't have some sensible, logically reasoned through, confirmed by many people of different perspectives to be a good idea, logical reason for doing the things they do. Most games, most things in human society do not have that. There isn't a good reason to do it that way. But there is a reason they're doing it that way. It's just not debatably very good, I would argue. And so the weird thing about talking about design is often we need to look at why you might do this, even though the reasons probably won't be very good for doing it. There are still reasons. And again, there are still effects. You know, what does having this stuff in the game cause? And since we didn't talk about that too much in this Parley, and it's not really your question, I will just summarize by saying it makes it a little confusing for people that analyze the game and notice these things, which are, you know, the people that it would maybe affect one way or another. It makes it confusing. It makes it seem contrived. Unless the game says, hey, on Hunting Horn, you're going to have to juggle your melodies, or hey, Xingqiu is more powerful, but more focused, a little more narrow than other characters. And ironically, he's kind of the opposite, but we won't get into that here. I don't know. I think it's kind of a lose-lose in many cases. I feel like these are just a really bad form of tutorial, basically. And they kind of could be made robust parts of the gameplay loop, but if they were, I think it would make sense for the game to say that they were. In other words, just say, hey, you may have noticed, because it's unbelievably obvious to notice this, that self-improvement is really easy to perform. It gives you good buffs, but you may have difficulty juggling all of your other melodies. Good luck. And like that 2.5 sentence blurb could just appear when you equip a hunting horn for the first time. That's it. That's all you'd have to do. Like, I really feel like that would be better if that complexity is meant to be there than just having it there. Or again, you could just delete self-improvement and then you get the benefit of the game is a little simpler. And that wasn't arguably adding complexity anyway. So really interesting topic to me. As you could probably tell, I'm quite emphatic about this subject, because it's interesting, isn't it? Like having a good reasoning behind why you do things in the game the way you do, having a design philosophy for the game, and propagating it out is valuable, but very rarely done, it seems. Or it's often done but then violated. A good example, if you're interested in that, is FromSoft. Listen to interviews about how they made the design principles they use to make Dark Souls and Elden Ring, and then think about playing those games. They're not like lying or something. They definitely did think that as they made those games, but they also did not achieve those goals consistently, which is very interesting. That can be very educational. And certainly having achieved them a little bit consistently could be argued to benefit the game a lot. Like that's still good. You get partial credit for me. I don't know. All beggars can't be choosers. And speaking of beggars, thank you very much for your support. Not at all. I appreciate it, Bionicme. I've been enjoying these Parley. You've been on a roll. You kind of didn't do them for a while, and then I believe got gifted one, and then you just started plowing through really good Parley topics. Awesome. So I'm looking forward to the next one. Folks, if you'd like to get Parley and join us making these, you could do that using a link in the description. You just join my Patreon or whatever platform you like, really, for a monthly fee, and I do whatever prompts you have and make a video about it and say what I've got to say and try to focus on the things that you were trying to say in equal measure to provide you with different perspectives while also exploring your topic for all to enjoy. Looking forward to it. See you in the next one.